Montezuma's Dilemma: When Gods and Men Collide. The Emperor's Burden. In the pre-dawn darkness of November 8, 1519, as the first light of Tenochtitlan, the sun god, painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson, Moctezuma II stood upon the highest terrace of his palace in Tenochtitlan, gazing across the vast expanse of Lake Texcoco toward the eastern causeway, where destiny approached in the form of strangers whose very existence challenged everything he had been taught about the nature of divinity, mortality, and imperial power. For 17 years, Moctezuma had ruled the greatest empire in the Americas with a wisdom and authority that had earned him recognition as the most powerful monarch in the known world. His word was law from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. His armies had never known defeat, and his wealth exceeded that of any European king. Yet now, as he watched the distant figures of mounted men and steel-armored soldiers advancing across the causeway like harbingers of cosmic transformation, the emperor faced a crisis that no amount of military might or accumulated wisdom could resolve through conventional means. The intelligence reports that had reached the imperial capital over the previous months painted a picture of beings so extraordinary that they seemed to exist beyond the normal categories of human understanding. These strangers possessed weapons that could kill from impossible distances with sounds like thunder. They rode atop creatures that were neither deer nor any known animal, and their leader wore a beard and pale skin that matched ancient prophecies describing the return of Quetzalcoatl, the Feathered Serpent deity who had ruled during the Golden Age, before departing across the Eastern Sea with promises to return when the cosmic cycles reached their appointed conclusion. The theological implications of these reports had created unprecedented turmoil within the imperial court as priests, astronomers, and advisors struggled to interpret events that seemed to transcend ordinary historical patterns, while demanding responses that could determine the fate of civilization itself. The sacred calendars indicated that this was indeed the year Quetzalcoatl, the prophesied time of Quetzalcoatl's return, while the astronomical observations confirmed unusual celestial phenomena that traditionally accompanied divine intervention in earthly affairs. Yet Moctezuma's own intelligence networks, which included the most sophisticated espionage system in Mesoamerica, provided information that complicated these supernatural interpretations. The strangers bled when wounded, required food and water like ordinary mortals, and displayed human emotions including greed, fear, and exhaustion that suggested they were subject to the same limitations that governed all earthly beings. Their weapons, however extraordinary, were clearly manufactured objects rather than divine emanations, while their behavior toward indigenous peoples revealed a pattern of violence and exploitation that seemed inconsistent with the benevolent nature traditionally attributed to returning deity. The strategic dilemma that confronted Moctezuma as he prepared to receive these mysterious visitors represented the ultimate test of imperial leadership, a situation where every possible course of action carried catastrophic risks while offering uncertain prospects for success. If these strangers were indeed divine beings whose arrival fulfilled ancient prophecies, then resistance would constitute cosmic sacrilege that could bring down the wrath of the gods upon his empire and his people. If they were merely unusually equipped mortals with imperial ambitions of their own, then accommodation could lead to conquest and the destruction of everything his ancestors had built over the centuries. The emperor's dilemma was further complicated by the political and military realities that governed imperial administration in a confederation as vast and diverse as the Aztec Empire. Any decision regarding the strangers would be scrutinized by tributary rulers throughout Mesoamerica, who were constantly evaluating the strength and wisdom of their imperial overlords, while seeking opportunities to improve their own positions within the regional power structure. A response that appeared weak or indecisive could trigger rebellions among subject peoples who might interpret uncertainty as evidence of divine disfavor or imperial decline. The religious responsibilities that defined Moctezuma's role as Huey Tlatoani required him to serve as the earthly representative of the gods, while maintaining the cosmic balance that ensured continued prosperity for his people. This sacred obligation demanded not only personal piety and ritual correctness, but also the wisdom to interpret divine will in unprecedented circumstances, while making decisions that honored both spiritual requirements and practical necessity. The emperor's every action was understood to carry cosmic significance that extended far beyond immediate political consequences, to influence the fundamental harmony between earthly and divine realm. The military advisors who surrounded Moctezuma, as he contemplated his response to the approaching strangers, represented the finest strategic minds in Mesoamerica. Yet even they struggled to develop effective responses to threats that seemed to operate outside the established parameters of conventional warfare. The reports of Spanish military capabilities suggested technological advantages that could neutralize traditional Aztec tactical superiority. Their alliance-building activities among discontented tributary peoples threatened to transform regional conflicts into existential struggles for imperial survival. The palace chambers that served as the setting for these momentous deliberations had witnessed centuries of imperial decision-making, but never had they hosted discussions that would determine whether the civilization they represented would continue to flourish or disappear forever beneath the advance of forces that combined unprecedented military capabilities with cosmic significance that remained frustratingly unclear. The carved stone walls that depicted the achievements of previous emperors seemed to watch silently as their successor grappled with challenges that dwarfed anything faced by his predecessor. As the sun climbed higher in the eastern sky and the moment of confrontation drew near, Moctezuma felt the crushing weight of responsibility that came with exercising absolute power during periods of absolute crisis. Every choice he made in the coming hours would be judged by history, by the gods, and by the millions of people whose lives depended upon the wisdom of their emperor's response to the most extraordinary challenge their civilization had ever faced. The web of prophecy, the prophetic traditions that had shaped Aztec understanding of cosmic cycles and divine intervention, created interpretive frameworks that both illuminated and obscured the significance of Spanish arrival, providing seemingly relevant guidance, while generating dangerous ambiguities that could lead imperial decision-making astray at precisely the moment when clarity and decisive action were most essential for survival. The prophecy of Quetzalcoatl's return represented the most significant and troubling of these ancient predictions, describing the eventual arrival of a bearded, light-skinned deity who would emerge from the eastern sea during the year Quetzalcoatl to reclaim his rightful position as ruler of the land he had governed during the Golden Age before his mysterious departure across the water. According to these sacred narratives, preserved in temple schools for over 500 years, the returning god would bring both wisdom and transformation, establishing a new order that would surpass even the greatest achievements of previous cosmic ages. The calendrical calculations that identified 11519 as the prophesied year of return created additional complications for Moctezuma's strategic planning, as the coincidence between European arrival and indigenous temporal predictions suggested either remarkable cosmic synchronicity or evidence of divine orchestration that demanded appropriate reverence and caution. The priest astronomers who maintained these chronological systems possessed detailed knowledge of cyclical patterns that had proven accurate in predicting agricultural seasons, astronomical events, and historical developments across centuries of observation and calculation. The physical descriptions contained within the Quetzalcoatl prophecies seemed to match reports of Spanish appearance and equipment in ways that suggested either supernatural prescience or the fulfillment of genuine divine promises. The predicted beard, pale skin, and Eastern origin of the returning deity corresponded precisely to Spanish characteristics, while the prophetic references to unusual animals and divine weapons could be interpreted as descriptions of horses and firearms that indigenous peoples had never previously encountered. Yet the behavioral patterns attributed to the returning Quetzalcoatl in prophetic literature emphasized benevolence, wisdom, and concern for human welfare that seemed inconsistent with Spanish actions throughout their journey from the coast to the imperial capital. The historical Quetzalcoatl had been remembered as a ruler who promoted peace, learning, and artistic achievement, while opposing human sacrifice and military aggression. The reports reaching Tenochtitlan described Spanish forces that engaged in systematic violence, demanded tribute from communities they had no right to tax, and displayed an obsession with gold that suggested material rather than spiritual motivation. The theological debates that raged within imperial court circles reflected these contradictions, while revealing the challenges involved in interpreting ancient prophecies within contemporary context that might differ significantly from the circumstances envisioned by their original creator. Some priests argued that divine beings might adopt harsh methods to test human faith and obedience while accomplishing cosmic purposes that transcended ordinary moral categories. Others suggested that the prophecies had been misinterpreted or that the Spanish arrival represented a different type of divine intervention than the one described in traditional narrative. The political implications of prophetic interpretation extended far beyond religious speculation to influence practical decisions about military preparation, diplomatic strategy, and resource allocation that would determine imperial survival during the approaching crisis. If the strangers were indeed divine messengers, whose arrival fulfilled ancient promises, then resistance could constitute cosmic rebellion that would bring catastrophic consequences for the empire and its people. If they were mortal enemies whose similarity to prophetic descriptions was merely coincidental, then accommodation could lead to conquest and cultural destruction. The alternative prophecies that existed alongside the Quetzalcoatl narratives provide additional perspectives on Spanish arrival, while complicating attempts to develop coherent interpretative framework. Some traditions predicted the eventual destruction of the fifth sun through foreign invasion and cultural transformation, suggesting that Spanish arrival might represent the beginning of cosmic renewal that would eliminate existing civilization while establishing new forms of existence. These eschatological prophecies offered little guidance for resistance strategies, while encouraging acceptance of change as inevitable cosmic necessity. The regional variations in prophetic tradition reflected different cultural perspectives and historical experiences throughout the empire, creating multiple interpretive possibilities that could support contradictory strategic responses to Spanish presence. The tributary peoples who preserved their own prophetic traditions alongside imposed imperial narratives might interpret Spanish arrival as liberation from Aztec domination, rather than divine visitation, requiring universal reverence and submission. The psychological impact of prophetic uncertainty created additional challenges for imperial leadership as Moctezuma struggled to maintain confidence and decisiveness while grappling with cosmic questions that had no clear answer. The emperor's advisors expected wisdom and guidance from their sovereign, yet the unprecedented nature of current circumstances made traditional sources of imperial knowledge inadequate for developing effective response strategies.
The temporal pressures that accompany prophetic interpretation meant that theological debates had to be concluded quickly enough to enable timely political and military responses to rapidly developing situations. The luxury of extended contemplation and careful analysis that normally characterized important imperial decisions was unavailable during crisis periods that demanded immediate action based on incomplete information and uncertain spiritual guidance. The practical consequences of prophetic belief meant that Moctezuma's interpretation of Spanish arrival would influence not only his own actions, but also the responses of priests, nobles, military commanders, and tributary rulers throughout the empire, who looked to their emperor for guidance about appropriate behavior during unprecedented circumstances. The interpretative framework that emerged from imperial deliberations would shape the actions of millions of people, while determining whether the empire would unite in resistance or fracture into competing factions with different understandings of cosmic necessity and divine will. The calculation of power. The intelligence networks that provided Moctezuma with detailed information about Spanish capabilities and intentions represented the most sophisticated espionage system in the pre-Columbian Americas. Yet even these extensive resources struggled to provide accurate assessments of threats that combined familiar human motivations with unprecedented technological advantages and unprecedented strategic objectives. The merchant spies, who formed the backbone of Aztec intelligence operations, had maintained surveillance of Spanish movements from the moment of their landing on the Mexican coast, providing regular reports about European military equipment, alliance-building activity, and behavioral patterns that revealed both strengths and vulnerabilities in the foreign expedition. These trained observers possessed the linguistic skills and cultural knowledge necessary to interpret Spanish actions, while maintaining cover identities that enabled close access to enemy planning sessions and strategic discussion. The military assessments that emerged from intelligence gathering operations painted a complex picture of Spanish capabilities that combined devastating advantages in certain areas with critical weaknesses that could be exploited through appropriate tactical responses. The firearms and steel weapons that had proven so effective against indigenous forces in initial encounters were limited by ammunition supplies, reloading requirements, and dependence upon maintenance procedures that could be disrupted through sustained pressure and strategic targeting. The cavalry units that had created such psychological impact during early confrontations were constrained by terrain limitations, logistical requirements, and numerical restrictions that meant they could dominate individual battles while remaining vulnerable to coordinated attacks that neutralized their mobility advantages. The horses that carried Spanish soldiers were themselves vulnerable to weapons and tactics that could eliminate their effectiveness, while creating opportunities for indigenous forces to acquire these valuable animals for their own use. The alliance patterns that characterized Spanish strategy throughout their advance toward Tenochtitlan revealed both the expedition's political sophistication and its fundamental dependence upon indigenous support that could be undermined through appropriate diplomatic and military intervention. The tributary peoples who had joined Spanish forces were motivated primarily by grievances against Aztec rule, rather than loyalty to European leadership, suggesting that alternative imperial policies might eliminate enemy recruitment while strengthening imperial unity. The logistical vulnerabilities that affected Spanish operations included dependence upon indigenous guides, interpreters, and suppliers who could be influenced through bribery, intimidation, or appeals to traditional loyalty. The expedition's supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of potentially hostile territory, while their communication networks relied upon indigenous intermediaries whose reliability could not be guaranteed during periods of crisis and conflict. The economic motivations that drove Spanish aggression suggested possibilities for negotiated settlements that might satisfy European desires for wealth, while preserving essential elements of imperial sovereignty and cultural autonomy. The reports of Spanish obsession with gold and precious metals indicated that tribute payments or trade arrangements might provide alternatives to military conquest, while buying time for more comprehensive strategic response. The technological limitations that constrained Spanish operations included ammunition shortages, equipment maintenance requirements, and communication difficulties that created opportunities for indigenous forces to exploit temporary weaknesses while developing counter-strategies that could neutralize European advantages over extended periods of conflict. The psychological factors that influenced Spanish behavior included homesickness, disease susceptibility, and fear of indigenous numerical superiority that could be exacerbated through appropriate propaganda and psychological warfare technique. The European soldiers who had volunteered for American service were motivated primarily by prospects for personal enrichment, rather than ideological commitment to conquest objectives, suggesting that military pressure and reduced profit expectations might encourage voluntary withdrawal. Leadership dynamics within Spanish expedition command structure revealed tensions between Cortés and his subordinates that could be exploited through diplomatic initiatives that encouraged factional conflicts, while offering alternative arrangements to officers who might be willing to abandon the commander in exchange for guarantees of personal security and financial compensation. The seasonal factors that affected Spanish military operations included weather patterns, agricultural cycle, and disease transmission rates that could be incorporated into imperial strategic planning, while timing major military initiatives to coincide with periods of maximum Spanish vulnerability and minimum imperial disadvantage. The regional political considerations that shaped Spanish alliance-building efforts included long-standing conflicts between indigenous peoples that could be mediated through imperial intervention, while eliminating European opportunities to exploit existing divisions for conquest purposes. The tributary relationships that connected various peoples to the Aztec Empire could be reformed and strengthened through policy modifications that addressed legitimate grievances while maintaining essential imperial structure. The strategic options that emerged from comprehensive intelligence analysis included military responses ranging from immediate attack to prolonged siege warfare, diplomatic initiatives involving negotiation and accommodation, economic strategies utilizing tribute and trade relations, and political approaches emphasizing imperial reform and tributary autonomy. Each possibility carried distinct advantages and risks that had to be evaluated against uncertain information about Spanish intentions and capabilities. The weight of the crown, the isolation that accompanied power during periods of existential crisis, created psychological burdens for Moctezuma that transcended the normal pressures of imperial leadership, while demanding personal courage and wisdom that no amount of royal education or governmental experience could fully prepare him to provide during circumstances that had no historical precedent or established protocols. The sleepless nights that characterized Moctezuma's final weeks of independent rule were filled with contemplation of decisions that would affect millions of lives, while determining whether the civilization he represented would survive or disappear beneath the advance of forces whose ultimate intentions remained frustratingly unclear, despite extensive intelligence gathering and diplomatic investigation. The prayers and rituals that occupied increasing amounts of the emperor's time reflected both personal spiritual needs and cosmic responsibilities that required divine guidance for decisions that exceeded purely human wisdom, while demanding supernatural support for actions that could influence the fundamental balance between earthly and celestial realm. The private ceremonies that Moctezuma conducted in his personal chambers included bloodletting rituals, incense offerings, and meditative practices that sought direct communication with patron deities, who might provide clarity about appropriate responses to unprecedented challenge. The family considerations that complicated imperial decision-making included concerns for the welfare of wives, children, and relatives who would bear the consequences of whatever choices their emperor made during the approaching crisis. The personal relationships that had sustained Moctezuma throughout his reign now became additional sources of pressure as he contemplated decisions that could result in their deaths, enslavement, or exile, while weighing family welfare against cosmic responsibility and imperial duty. The art and intellectual pursuits that had previously provided relaxation and personal fulfillment for the emperor became impossible to maintain during crisis periods that demanded constant attention to military and diplomatic developments, while eliminating opportunities for the cultural activities had distinguished Aztec civilization and provided meaning for imperial leadership. The poetry, music, and philosophical discussions that had characterized court life were replaced by endless strategy sessions and intelligence briefings that offered little inspiration or spiritual nourishment. The physical symptoms of stress that affected Moctezuma's health during this period included appetite loss, chronic headaches, and digestive problems that reflected the physiological impact of psychological pressure, while potentially compromising the emperor's ability to make sound decisions during critical moments, when mental clarity and emotional stability were essential for effective leadership. The diplomatic protocols that normally governed imperial interactions with foreign dignitaries provided no guidance for receiving visitors, whose status remained unclear, while whose presence challenged fundamental assumptions about sovereignty, divinity, and political authority that had structured Mesoamerican interstate relations for centuries. The ceremonial requirements that demonstrated imperial dignity and divine sanction had to be balanced against practical security considerations and theological uncertainties that made appropriate behavior difficult to determine.
The military preparations that accompanied diplomatic initiatives required careful coordination between defensive arrangements and ceremonial hospitality, while maintaining readiness for conflict, without appearing provocative or disrespectful to visitors, whose divine status remained possible despite their human characteristics and material motivations. Succession concerns that emerged as potential conflict approached included arrangements for governmental continuity in case of imperial death or incapacity, while ensuring that imperial authority would transfer smoothly to qualified leaders who could maintain resistance efforts or negotiate favorable terms depending upon circumstances that remained impossible to predict accurately. The financial considerations that influenced imperial decision-making included evaluation of economic costs associated with different response strategies, while assessing the empire's capacity to sustain prolonged military operations or tribute payments that might satisfy Spanish demands without completely depleting imperial resources or destroying economic foundations that supported imperial civilization. The cultural preservation priorities that shaped Moctezuma's planning included arrangements for protecting religious artifacts, historical and artistic treasures that represented the accumulated achievements of Aztec civilization, while ensuring that essential knowledge would survive regardless of political outcomes or military developments. The psychological techniques that the emperor employed to maintain emotional equilibrium during crisis periods included meditation practices, philosophical reflection, and spiritual exercises that helped preserve mental clarity while providing emotional strength necessary for continued leadership despite overwhelming pressure and impossible choices. The imperial legacy considerations that influenced strategic planning included concern for historical reputation, cosmic judgment that would evaluate imperial actions according to standards that transcended immediate practical consequences, while encompassing spiritual and cultural dimensions that defined the ultimate meaning and significance of imperial leadership during civilization-defining.
The fateful meeting, the ceremonial arrangements that governed the historic encounter between Moctezuma and Cortés on November 8, 1519, represented the collision of two entirely different concepts of political authority, divine sanction, and imperial dignity, creating a diplomatic spectacle that satisfied neither party's expectations while establishing precedents for miscommunication and misunderstanding that would characterize all subsequent interactions between Aztec and Spanish leadership. The processional route that carried the emperor from his palace to the meeting point on the southern causeway had been designed to demonstrate imperial magnificence while providing maximum security for the sovereign, whose personal safety remained uncertain. Despite diplomatic assurances and ceremonial protocols, the litter that bore Moctezuma was constructed from the finest materials available in Mesoamerica, its golden framework supporting a canopy of precious feathers that caught and reflected sunlight in patterns that seemed to pulse with supernatural life. The attendants who accompanied the imperial procession included the highest-ranking nobles in the empire, each wearing regalia that demonstrated their elevated status while contributing to the overall visual impact of imperial grandeur that was intended to impress foreign visitors with the wealth, sophistication, and divine sanction that characterized Aztec civilization. The priests who marched alongside the imperial litter carried incense burners that filled the air with copal smoke while chanting prayers that sought divine protection for their emperor during his unprecedented encounter with beings whose spiritual status remained uncertain. The military escorts that provided security for the imperial procession maintained strict formation discipline while remaining prepared for immediate combat should the diplomatic meeting prove to be an elaborate trap designed to eliminate Aztec leadership through treachery and surprise attack. The warriors who accompanied their emperor wore their finest battle regalia while carrying weapons that had been blessed through elaborate ceremonies designed to ensure their effectiveness against both mortal enemies
and supernatural threats. The Spanish reception of these ceremonial displays revealed fundamental misunderstandings about indigenous political culture, while demonstrating European inability to appreciate the complex symbolism and spiritual significance that characterized Aztec diplomatic protocols. The conquistadors who witnessed Moctezuma's approach interpreted the imperial grandeur as evidence of vast wealth awaiting conquest, rather than as expressions of political authority and divine sanction that demanded respect and reciprocal courtesy. The translation difficulties that complicated initial communications between Spanish and Aztec leadership reflected not only linguistic barriers, but also conceptual differences regarding sovereignty and interstate relations that made meaningful diplomatic exchange virtually impossible despite the presence of skilled interpreters who possessed technical competence in multiple languages. The concepts that each side attempted to communicate often had no equivalent in the other's cultural vocabulary, while carrying implications and assumptions that could not be accurately conveyed through literal translation. The gift exchange that followed formal greetings revealed additional areas of cultural miscommunication, as each side attempted to follow appropriate diplomatic protocols while interpreting the other's gestures according to their own cultural standards and political expectations. The Spanish offerings of European manufactured goods were intended to demonstrate superior technology, while asserting claims to political dominance based on material advantages. The Aztec gifts of precious feathers, jade ornaments, and artistic textiles were designed to display imperial wealth, while acknowledging the visitor's possible divine status through appropriate ritual courtesy. The housing arrangements that provided accommodation for Spanish forces with Tenochtitlan represented Moctezuma's attempt to maintain diplomatic courtesy while ensuring surveillance and control over potentially dangerous visitors, whose ultimate intentions remained unclear despite ceremonial assurances and peaceful overture. The palace complex assigned to Spanish use included luxurious quarters that demonstrated imperial hospitality while providing security features that could transform guest accommodation into defensive positions or prison facilities, depending upon subsequent development. The intelligence gathering that both sides conducted during initial interactions included careful observation of military capabilities, political structures, and cultural practices that could provide advantages during subsequent negotiation. The Spanish officers who explored their assigned quarters conducted systematic reconnaissance while evaluating defensive possibilities and escape routes that might become necessary if diplomatic relations deteriorated into open hostility. The theological consultations that occupied both Spanish and Aztec leadership during the early period of coexistence reflected attempts to understand each other's religious beliefs and cosmic perspectives, while seeking common ground that might enable peaceful resolution of territorial and sovereignty disputes. The Spanish priests who accompanied Cortés attempted to convert their hosts to Christianity, while gathering information about indigenous religious practices that could be eliminated or transformed to support colonial administration. The political calculations that shaped both sides' strategies during initial interactions included evaluation of alliance possibilities, assessment of military risks, and consideration of economic opportunities that could justify continued cooperation despite fundamental disagreements about authority, territory, and cultural autonomy. The imperial advisors who counseled Moctezuma provided conflicting recommendations based on different interpretations of Spanish intentions and capability, while disagreeing about optimal responses to unprecedented challenges. The psychological dynamics that developed between Spanish and Aztec leadership during their prolonged cohabitation created personal relationships that complicated political calculations while generating emotional investments that could influence strategic decisions in ways that might contradict purely rational analysis of interests and capability. The daily interactions between conquerors
and conquered established patterns of communication and mutual understanding that would prove crucial during subsequent crisis periods, when diplomatic solutions remained possible despite deteriorating political circumstance. The trap springs closed. The arrest of Moctezuma by Spanish forces on November 4 transforming what had appeared to be a complex, but potentially manageable political situation into an existential crisis that would determine whether indigenous civilization could survive the European assault on its foundations of authority, culture, and cosmic order. The pretext that Cortés employed to justify imperial kidnapping involved accusations of treachery related to attacks on Spanish forces by Aztec commanders in coastal regions, creating legal frameworks that satisfied European concepts of justified retaliation, while providing minimal recognition of indigenous sovereignty or diplomatic immunity that might protect imperial persons from foreign aggression. The Spanish demand that Moctezuma accompany them to their quarters for protection and investigation represented a transparent attempt to seize control of imperial authority, while maintaining the fiction of voluntary cooperation. The emperor's decision to submit to Spanish demands rather than resist capture reflected complex calculations about alternative possibilities and likely consequences that might result from different responses to an unprecedented crisis that offered no clear guidance from historical precedent or established political theory. The resistance that would have accompanied refusal to comply with Spanish demands might have resulted in immediate violence that could eliminate imperial leadership while triggering chaotic retaliation that would devastate the capital and destroy any possibility of negotiated resolution. Psychological impact of imperial captivity upon Aztec political institutions created a constitutional crisis that paralyzed governmental functions while undermining the religious foundations of political authority that depended upon the emperor's freedom to perform ritual obligations and exercise divine prerogatives. The sight of their sovereign under foreign control demonstrated to imperial subjects that the cosmic order they had served throughout their lives was vulnerable to disruption by forces that operated outside traditional categories of political and spiritual authority. The practical consequences of Spanish control over imperial person included their ability to issue orders in Moctezuma's name, while preventing independent communication between the emperor and his officials, military commanders, or religious advisors who might organize resistance efforts or alternative governmental structure. The isolation that surrounded the captive emperor enabled Spanish manipulation of imperial authority for conquest purposes, while eliminating indigenous opportunities to develop effective countermeasures or defensive strategy. Fiction of voluntary imperial cooperation included public appearances where Moctezuma appeared to endorse Spanish policies while receiving visitors and conducting business under conditions that concealed the coercive nature of his situation from subjects who might otherwise recognize the emperor's captivity and respond with appropriate resistance. These theatrical displays required careful choreography to maintain credibility while preventing communication that might reveal Spanish vulnerability or imperial resistance possibilities. The resistance networks that developed imperial nobles and military commanders, despite Spanish surveillance efforts, created underground communication systems that attempted to coordinate offensive preparations while planning rescue operations that might restore imperial independence or establish alternative governmental structure capable of continuing resistance after imperial elimination. The secrecy required for these activities made coordination difficult, while exposing participants to discovery and punishment that could eliminate indigenous leadership capacity. The religious complications that accompanied imperial captivity included disruption of ceremonial cycles that required imperial participation, while raising theological questions about the emperor's divine status and cosmic authority that could not be maintained under conditions of foreign domination. The priests who served imperial religious functions faced impossible choices between collaborating with Spanish authorities and maintaining ritual obligations that might conflict with conquest objectives and European religious sensibility. The economic disruption that resulted from political chaos included breakdown of tribute collection systems, interruption of trade networks, and suspension of public works projects that had employed thousands of workers, while generating wealth that supported imperial administration and cultural development. The uncertainty about governmental stability and future prospects created conditions that discouraged productive investment, while encouraging hoarding and defensive strategies that reduced overall economic activity. The military implications of imperial captivity included confusion about command authority, uncertainty about strategic objective, and disagreement about appropriate responses to Spanish aggression that prevented coordinated resistance, while enabling European forces to consolidate their position through divide-and-conquer tactics that exploited indigenous political divisions and communication difficulty. The diplomatic consequences of Spanish actions included destruction of trust that had enabled initial accommodation, while demonstrating European willingness to violate established protocols and moral standards that governed interstate relations throughout Mesoamerica. The precedent established by imperial kidnapping suggested that no agreements or assurances could be trusted, while indicating that Spanish objectives included complete domination rather than merely tribute extraction or commercial privilege. The temporal dimensions of captivity crisis include recognition that prolonged Spanish control over imperial authority would inevitably result in complete political transformation, while making restoration of indigenous independence increasingly difficult as European forces consolidated their advantages and eliminated potential sources of resistance through systematic elimination of indigenous leadership and cultural institutions.
The breaking point. The massacre at the Templo Mayor during the festival of Toxcatli in May 1520 represented the moment when the accumulated tensions, misunderstandings, and suppressed hostilities that had characterized Spanish-Aztec relations since Cortés's arrival finally erupted into the violent confrontation that both sides had struggled to avoid, while pursuing incompatible objectives that made conflict inevitable, despite diplomatic efforts and mutual recognition of catastrophic consequences. The festival preparations that had occupied Tenochtitlan for weeks prior to the ceremony represented traditional religious observances that honored Tezcatlipoca through elaborate rituals, artistic displays, and community participation that demonstrated cultural continuity while providing spiritual renewal for imperial subjects whose lives had been disrupted by foreign presence and political uncertainty. The ceremonies were designed to restore cosmic balance while seeking divine guidance for challenges that exceeded normal human capacity to resolve through conventional means. The Spanish interpretation of festival activities as evidence of planned rebellion or coordinated resistance reflected cultural incomprehension and paranoid suspicions that transformed religious observances into perceived security threats, while justifying preemptive violence that violated every principle of diplomatic immunity and religious sanctuary that governed civilized behavior throughout Mesoamerica. The decision to attack unarmed ceremonial participants demonstrated European willingness to employ terror tactics that exceeded normal military necessity, while revealing fundamental contempt for indigenous culture and spiritual practices. The attack itself unfolded with devastating suddenness. Spanish soldiers surrounded the temple courtyard, where hundreds of Aztec nobles were performing traditional dances that had honored their gods for centuries, while celebrating cultural achievements that represented the highest expressions of their civilization. The European weapons that had been designed for battlefield use proved horrifically effective against participants who wore ceremonial regalia rather than military protection, while carrying ritual implements instead of defensive weapons. The systematic nature of Spanish violence revealed careful planning that had identified strategic targets
while developing tactical approaches designed to maximize casualties among indigenous leadership while eliminating potential sources of organized resistance. The attackers focused their assault on nobles, priests, and cultural leaders, whose elimination would decapitate Aztec political and religious institutions, while creating power vacuums that could be filled by Spanish appointees or collaborative indigenous administrators. The immediate aftermath, the massacre created chaos that spread throughout the imperial capital as news of Spanish atrocity triggered spontaneous uprisings among populations, whose anger and grief overcame their fear of European military superiority, while generating emotional energy that unified previously divided social groups in common cause against foreign oppression. The violence that erupted represented not merely political rebellion, but cosmic outrage at sacrilege that demanded divine vengeance, regardless of practical consequences or survival prospects. The siege warfare that developed as Aztec forces attempted to eliminate Spanish presence from their capital demonstrated indigenous military capabilities that had been underestimated by European commanders who had attributed their previous victories to technological superiority rather than psychological advantages that disappeared when confronted by enemies who no longer feared death or cared about material losses. The urban combat that characterized the siege neutralized many Spanish advantages, while providing defensive benefits to indigenous forces who possessed intimate knowledge of local terrain and architectural features. The propaganda efforts that both sides employed during the siege included attempts to justify their actions, while demoralizing enemy forces through psychological warfare techniques that emphasized moral authority and divine support for their respective causes. The Spanish claims of superior civilization and religious authority were countered by Aztec assertions of legitimate resistance to foreign aggression and defense of sacred traditions that connected earthly existence to cosmic purposes. The diplomatic initiatives that continued despite ongoing combat reflected recognition by both sides that military victory might prove impossible or prohibitively costly, while creating opportunities for negotiated settlements that could preserve essential interests without requiring total elimination of opposing forces. The intermediaries who attempted to facilitate communication between Spanish and Aztec leadership faced enormous challenges in finding common ground between parties whose fundamental assumptions about sovereignty, authority, and cultural autonomy remained irreconcilable. The leadership changes that accompanied crisis conditions included the death of Moctezuma under circumstances that remained disputed, while reflecting the breakdown of political structures that had maintained imperial stability for generations. The succession process that elevated Quetzalcoatl to imperial authority represented indigenous attempts to restore legitimate governance, while organizing effective resistance against foreign occupation that threatened cultural survival, as well as political independence. The strategic assessments that guided both Spanish and Aztec decision-making during the siege period revealed fundamental miscalculations about enemy capabilities, populace, and the logistical sustainability that would influence subsequent military operations, while demonstrating the limited value of conventional intelligence gathering when confronting unprecedented situations that exceeded historical experience and established analytical framework. The human costs of escalating conflict included civilian casualties, economic disruption, and social trauma that extended far beyond immediate military objectives, while creating psychological wounds that would influence subsequent generations' understanding of cultural identity, historical memory, and relationship with foreign powers whose presence had transformed indigenous existence in ways that could never be completely reversed or forgotten. The price of divinity. The final months of Moctezuma's reign represented the tragic culmination of a crisis that had tested the fundamental assumptions underlying Aztec civilization, while demonstrating the limitations of even the most sophisticated indigenous political systems when confronted by challenges
that operated outside established categories of spiritual authority, temporal power, and cosmic order. The emperor's captivity transformed him from the most powerful ruler in the Americas into a symbol of indigenous vulnerability, whose every public appearance reminded his subjects of their civilization's helplessness before foreign aggression, while undermining traditional beliefs about divine protection and cosmic justice that had sustained Mesoamerican cultures for over a millennium. The psychological impact of witnessing their sovereign's humiliation created spiritual trauma that exceeded purely political consequences, while challenging theological frameworks that connected earthly authority to celestial governance. The internal conflicts that developed within Aztec leadership during this period reflected disagreement about optimal responses to unprecedented circumstances, while revealing tensions between traditional approaches that emphasized diplomatic accommodation and emerging factions that advocate total resistance regardless of consequences. The debates that raged within imperial councils included fundamental questions about cultural survival, spiritual integrity, and political legitimacy that had no clear answers, while demanding immediate decisions that would determine collective destiny. The religious crisis that accompanied political upheaval included disruption of ceremonial cycles, suspension of traditional festivals, and theological questioning that undermined spiritual foundations of imperial authority, while creating uncertainty about divine will and cosmic purpose that had previously provided meaning and direction for individual and collective existence. The priests who served as intermediaries between human and divine realms struggled to interpret unprecedented events within established spiritual frameworks, while maintaining ritual obligations despite political chaos and cultural disruption. The economic consequences of prolonged crisis included breakdown of tribute systems, disruption of trade networks, and suspension of public works projects that had employed thousands of workers, while demonstrating imperial capability and divine favor. The uncertainty about future prospects discouraged productive investment, while encouraging defensive strategies that reduced overall economic activity and eliminated resources that might support resistance efforts or reconstruction programs. The social transformation that accompanied political crisis included changes in class relationships, modification of cultural practice, and emergence of new leadership patterns that reflected adaptation to circumstances that required different skills and priorities than those that had characterized traditional imperial administration. The individuals who rose to prominence during crisis periods often possessed military or diplomatic capabilities that differed from the artistic, religious, and administrative talents that had been valued during peaceful times. The cultural preservation efforts that occupied increasing attention during imperial decline included attempts to protect religious artifacts, historical records, and artistic treasures, while ensuring that essential knowledge would survive regardless of political outcomes or military development. The recognition that Spanish victory might eliminate indigenous governmental institutions created urgency about maintaining cultural continuity through alternative means that could transcend political structures, while preserving spiritual and intellectual achievements for future generations. The psychological preparation that occupied Moctezuma's final weeks included acceptance of personal mortality, while seeking meaning in circumstances that had exceeded his capacity to control through conventional imperial authority. The emperor's contemplation of historical legacy and cosmic significance revealed both personal courage and spiritual depth that enabled continued leadership despite overwhelming pressure and impossible choices that offered no prospect of satisfactory resolution. The death of Moctezuma in July 1520 under circumstances that remained disputed between Spanish and indigenous sources marked the end of an era in Mesoamerican history, while symbolizing the broader cultural transformation that would eliminate traditional indigenous political institutions and replace them with colonial administrative systems that served European rather than native interests. The emperor's passing represented not merely individual mortality, but civilizational transition that would affect millions of lives across generations of cultural adaptation and resistance. Evaluated Moctezuma's responses to Spanish invasion reflects ongoing debates about leadership responsibilities during impossible circumstances, while acknowledging the extraordinary challenges faced by indigenous rulers, whose traditional wisdom and established institutions proved inadequate, confronting threats that operated outside normal categories of political and military analysis. The Emperor's Dilemma represented universal challenges of leadership during transitional periods, when existing frameworks become obsolete while new approaches remain unclear. The legacy that emerged from Moctezuma's tragic reign included both cautionary lessons about the dangers of accommodation with implacable enemies and inspirational examples of dignity maintained under impossible pressure, while serving responsibilities that transcended personal survival or individual comfort. The Emperor's struggle to balance cosmic obligations with practical necessities provided models for subsequent indigenous leaders who would face similar challenges during centuries of colonial domination and cultural resistance. In understanding Moctezuma's dilemma, we glimpsed the profound challenges that face any civilization when confronted by forces that challenge its fundamental assumptions, while demanding responses that exceed its traditional capabilities. The collision between divine authority and mortal ambition, between cosmic responsibility and practical necessity, between spiritual integrity and political survival represents eternal themes that remain relevant for leaders in any era who must navigate between ideal principles and available possibilities, while serving responsibilities that extend beyond personal welfare to encompass collective destiny and cultural continuity.